This morning, motorists across the United States woke to a number that 6 months ago would have seemed impossible. The national average price for a gallon of regular gasoline reached 6.10s. In California, drivers were paying 7,080s. In New York, 6.90s. In rural areas where alternatives to driving do not exist, people were choosing between fuel and groceries. And the price was still climbing. 6 months ago, before military operations against Iran escalated into sustained conflict, gasoline averaged 3.40 cents per gallon. The increase of 2.70 cents represents a 79% spike. For a family driving 2 vehicles, the monthly fuel bill had increased from roughly $400 to over $700. That additional $300 per month was coming out of budgets already strained by inflation in food, housing, and healthcare costs. Something had to give. The spike was not driven by normal market dynamics of supply and demand fluctuations. It was the direct result of a strategic choke point being effectively closed. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day had flowed before the conflict, had been rendered impassable for commercial shipping. Iranian naval mines, mini-submarines, and drone swarms had created an environment where no insurance company would underwrite tanker transit. Without insurance, shipping companies refused to send vessels through the strait. The flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to global markets had stopped. Alternative routes existed. Oil could be transported overland through pipelines crossing Turkey and Azerbaijan, then shipped from ports on the Black Sea or Mediterranean. But pipeline capacity was limited to approximately 5 million barrels per day, roughly a quarter of what the strait had carried. The shortfall was immediate and severe. Global oil markets operate on thin margins. The loss of 16 million barrels per day of supply created a supply shock that drove prices to levels not seen since the brief spike during the early stages of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged to $145 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate, the US benchmark, hit $140. Refineries, already operating near capacity, could not increase output enough to compensate for the lost crude imports. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, created in 1975 after the Arab oil embargo to provide a buffer against exactly this kind of supply disruption, became the backstop. The administration authorized daily releases of 2 million barrels to stabilize domestic markets. Initially, this helped. Prices moderated slightly as the additional supply entered the market. But the reserve was not infinite. 6 months before the conflict, the SPR held 350 million barrels, down from historical highs of over 700 million, but still substantial. The administration had been drawing down the reserve for years to manage prices during various supply disruptions. When the Hormuz crisis began, the decision was made to accelerate releases. 2 million barrels per day, every day, flowing from underground salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana into the commercial market. The math was straightforward and unforgiving. At 2 million barrels per day, the reserve was being depleted at a rate of 60 million barrels per month. After 6 months of sustained releases, the SPR had dropped from 350 million barrels to 105 million. At current rate of draw, the reserve would be effectively empty in less than 2 months, and then there would be no buffer at all. Energy economists and government analysts understood what that meant. When the SPR reached zero, the United States would have no mechanism to moderate price spikes. The market would be purely at the mercy of global supply and demand. And with the Strait of Hormuz closed, demand far exceeded supply. Prices would go higher. How much higher was uncertain, but projections ranged from $8 to $10 per gallon for gasoline. At those levels, the economic impacts would cascade beyond transportation into every sector. Trucking companies, which move the majority of goods across the United States, were already cutting routes and raising prices. A 60% increase in fuel costs translated directly into shipping rate increases. Retailers absorbed some of the cost, but most was passed to consumers. Grocery prices climbed 35% in 6 months. Not because food production had declined, but because the cost of transporting food from farms to processing facilities to distribution centers to stores had become prohibitive. Airlines were facing similar pressures. Jet fuel prices had increased in line with gasoline. Carriers responded by cutting routes, reducing flight frequency, and raising ticket prices. Average domestic airfare increased 80%. International flights, which required even more fuel, saw price increases exceeding 100%. Leisure travel collapsed. Business travel continued, but at significantly reduced levels. The airline industry, which had just recovered from pandemic-era disruptions, was facing another existential crisis. Layoffs began. 18,000 employees across major carriers were furloughed or terminated in the past month alone. Manufacturing, particularly heavy industry, was slowing. Energy costs for production had reached levels where operating at full capacity was no longer profitable for many facilities. Factories moved to reduced shifts, some shut down entirely, waiting for energy prices to moderate. Unemployment, which had been stable at 3.7% 6 months ago, climbed to 4.8%. The trajectory was upward. Economists were revising their projections weekly, and none of the revisions were optimistic. The Federal Reserve faced an impossible dilemma. Inflation, driven primarily by energy costs, was running at 8.4% annually. The traditional response to high inflation is to raise interest rates, which slows economic activity and reduces demand, theoretically bringing prices down. But raising rates in an economy already weakening due to energy shocks risked triggering a deeper recession. The Fed raised rates cautiously, but the moves were criticized from all sides. Some argued the increases were too small to control inflation. Others argued they were too large and would accelerate job losses. Consumer behavior was shifting in ways that had broader economic implications. Vehicle miles traveled declined 25% as people combined trips, worked from home where possible, and simply drove less. Public transportation systems, many of which were already operating at capacity, could not absorb the additional demand. Commutes became longer and more uncomfortable. Frustration mounted. Electric vehicle sales surged. Buyers who had been considering EVs as a future option accelerated their purchases. Dealerships reported 400% increases in EV sales compared to the same period the previous year. But production could not keep pace with demand. Waiting lists extended 8 to 12 months. Used EV prices increased 150% as buyers sought immediate alternatives to gasoline vehicles. For many Americans, particularly those in lower income brackets, an electric vehicle was not a realistic option regardless of fuel savings. The upfront cost was prohibitive, and the used market was now priced out of reach. The administration explored every available option to increase supply and reduce prices. Diplomatic pressure was applied to OPEC members, particularly Saudi Arabia, to increase production. The Saudis declined. High oil prices were profitable, and increasing production to offset the Hormuz shortfall would require investment and reduce per-barrel revenues. There was no economic incentive for them to help stabilize prices. Negotiations with Venezuela and reconsideration of sanctions on Iranian oil were discussed internally. The irony of seeking oil from Iran while conducting military operations against the country was not lost on anyone involved. The conversations went nowhere. Lifting sanctions on Iranian oil while simultaneously bombing Iranian military installations was politically and strategically incoherent. Renewable energy advocates pointed to the crisis as proof that dependence on fossil fuels created unacceptable vulnerabilities. They were correct, but renewables could not solve the immediate problem. Solar and wind capacity could not be built fast enough to replace the lost oil supply. Electric vehicles, even with surging sales, represented less than 10% of the vehicle fleet. Transitioning the entire economy away from oil dependence was a multi-decade project. The crisis was happening now. Stock markets reflected the economic deterioration. The S&P 500 had declined 18% over 6 months. Sectors tied to consumer discretionary spending were hit hardest. Retail, hospitality, and entertainment stocks fell 25 to 30%. Energy company stocks, paradoxically, were among the few gainers, benefiting from high oil prices. But overall market sentiment was deeply negative. Investor confidence had collapsed, capital was moving to safer assets, economic activity was contracting. Housing markets, which had been cooling due to rising mortgage rates, effectively froze. High fuel costs made commuting from suburban or rural areas expensive, reducing demand for homes in those locations. Urban housing remained expensive, and buyers could not afford both high home prices and high transportation costs. Transaction volume plummeted. Construction starts declined. The housing sector, a major driver of economic growth, was stalling. Political pressure on the administration intensified. Members of Congress from both parties demanded action. Some called for ending military operations against Iran and negotiating a resolution that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Others argued for escalating military action to force Iran to capitulate. There was no consensus. The administration was caught between competing demands, unable to satisfy either camp. Public opinion polls showed a sharp turn against the conflict. 6 months earlier, 52% of Americans supported military operations. Now, only 29% did. The shift was driven by economic pain. when gasoline was 3.40 cents per gallon and the economy was growing. Abstract concepts of deterrence and regional stability had public support. When gasoline was 6.1 cents and people were losing jobs, the calculation changed. The war was no longer worth the cost. Iran understood this dynamic. Their strategy was not to defeat the US military in direct combat. It was to impose economic costs that would erode political support for continued operations. By closing the Strait of Hormuz, they had turned oil into a weapon. Every dollar increase in gasoline prices translated into political pressure on the administration. Every job lost was another voter questioning the war. Every percentage point increase in inflation was another argument for withdrawal. The midterm elections were 5 months away. Polling indicated that the party controlling the White House was facing significant losses. Voters attributed the economic pain to the administration's handling of the Iran conflict. Campaign messaging from opposition candidates focused relentlessly on gasoline prices, inflation, and job losses. Defending the war in that environment was nearly impossible. Economists began using the word that had been carefully avoided: recession. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth was the technical definition. The first quarter had shown minimal growth of 4.2%, down from 2.1% the previous quarter. Preliminary data for the second quarter indicated contraction. If confirmed, the United States would officially be in recession. The human impact of the numbers was visible everywhere. Food banks reported 60% increases in demand. Families that had been financially stable 6 months ago were now struggling to cover basic expenses. The additional $300 per month in fuel costs, combined with higher food prices and potential job loss or reduced hours, had pushed them to the edge. Social services, already underfunded, were overwhelmed. 50 days. That was how long the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would last at current draw rates. After that, there would be no buffer. Prices would rise further. The economic situation would deteriorate faster. And unless the Strait of Hormuz reopened, or alternative supplies materialized from sources that did not currently exist, the United States would be facing an energy crisis unprecedented in modern history. Iran had not invaded American territory. They had not sunk carrier battle groups. They had not launched missiles at US cities. They had closed a narrow waterway and waited for economics to do the work. And it was working. The war was being fought at gas stations, grocery stores, and unemployment offices. And America was losing.